Well, Byron and Ellen, a warm welcome to the conference. It's great to see you here, and you're part of the international representation that at the conference, and which has made it a very successful one this time round, as was the first one. Byron, you've included in the pack for the conference is your definition of ME from the Nightingale Foundation. Would you like to say a little bit about that and about how it differs from and what's important about it with regard to other definitions of ME?
Well, there's too much in that pamphlet to really discuss briefly, but there are a few things that I would like to mention. All disease entities, to get adequate treatment and even cures, you want to be able to identify that patient with that illness literally the first week of their illness. You have a much better chance of treating the patient. For instance, if the patient has a strep throat, you don't wait 6 months until the kidneys and the heart are destroyed before you start treatment. The same thing is true of ME. ME is different from chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a definition. ME is a disease, a syndrome which has been well known in the United Kingdom and in the United States since 1934. What our definition basically does is identify this disease process and gives the physician clues of early diagnosis. It also discusses ME as a pathology of the brain and the vascular system, which is measurable. And this is another thing. If you look at chronic fatigue syndrome, it's essentially a diagnosis based on symptoms. Well, there are very few symptoms that any human has when they're ill. They can have swelling, they can have redness, they can have fever, they can have fatigue, and literally all illnesses have variations of about half a dozen to a dozen symptoms. I think that you cannot distinguish a disease process. You need tests, you need physical signs, and ways to measure. And what our definition of ME does is point out some of these.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. What do you think is we have a big problem with a delay in getting the diagnosis because no one does anything for 6 months. And do you think this has a big impact on the younger people, particularly, who seem to be being missed in the present diagnostic regime, such as we have it in the UK, which is largely handed over to the psychiatrists? What do you think about that?
Well, if you consider the definition for chronic fatigue syndrome of waiting 6 months, and then turning the patient over to a psychiatrist, which might take another 6 months to 3 or 4 years, all you're doing is causing that illness process to keep progressing until the patient is permanently injured. I think a psychiatrist is a very useful person in managing problems caused by disease. For instance, if you can't work and you're poor, how do you handle the stresses? But this is not a psychiatric disease. ME has never been a psychiatric disease. You're not dealing with depression, you're not dealing with schizophrenia, you're not dealing with a social deviance of any sort. What you're dealing with is a central nervous system injury of the vascular system, which progresses to cause cardiac problems, much increased risk of malignancy, and probably other organ disruption, as we've seen today at the meeting here in London. I think it's very, very important to look at ME as a physiological injury and to treat it as rapidly as possible.
So you would certainly be advocating sensible tests to be done, which would be helpful to the physician in making the diagnosis?
Absolutely. But part of the problem is our entire medical system now is essentially devoted to getting the patient in and out of the office rapidly. And at this meeting, one of the physicians mentioned that in the United States, the average time in the office is no longer 8 minutes, but 3 minutes. You cannot deal with a patient with chronic illness and even take a good history. You need time as well as testing. The physicians aren't paid sufficiently to have them interested in this kind of illness, which takes time. You need an integrated system with appropriate medical clinics, biomedical clinics, not psychiatric clinics, to properly investigate these patients right at the early parts of the disease. And many of these patients are essentially treatable if you get them early enough. And unless you have this integrated medical system set up, regular medicine today, whether it's in the United Kingdom or United States or Canada or any place, is not going to be appropriate to this type of chronic disease, or for that matter, any kind of chronic disease.
Thank you. Now, Ellen, you received a great welcome when you made your presentation.
Yes.
Because you in Norway have been faced with exactly the same problem that we've just been talking about, the psychiatric-led diagnosis and claims of what the illness, the nature of the illness is. No testing to be done, little testing to be done, but you've got past that all. How did you do it?
Wow, it was a long, long battle. And we have, it's been a combination of luck, or I call it the upstairs department, whatever that is. We had the feeling that we had some help from somewhere.
Yes.
And it's just wonderful. What actually really pushed the thing along was also the media.
Right.
And we had this vaccination case, which was the first thing that when you were in Oslo, Professor Ola Didrik Saugstad asked the audience how many had participated in this vaccination trials some 15 years ago. We knew of 4 people who got ME after that, and all of a sudden we were 20.
Yeah.
And that started the ball to roll.
Right. What was the vaccine?
That was the meningococcal B vaccination, a vaccination which was developed in Norway by the National Institute of Public Health. And it's come to light they haven't followed up properly. The only thing they looked at was whether or not they got meningitis.
Right.
But not the fact that some of them got ill afterwards. That was ignored.
So how did you progress when you had this awareness?
Well, the thing was, the media got interested because you can't make psychiatry out of the effect of a vaccine.
Right.
And then the other medias also got interested in the patients and the patient's stories. And what they did was to run a series of articles about the patient's plight, how they live with this thing. And kept the doctors out of it. You know, it was just the stories.
Yes.
And I think it grabbed the hearts to not only the journalists, but of course other people realized that's why I'm ill.
Yeah.
So we had all this tremendous response. It's been very tough, and also it got to the politicians. And we got the impression that a lot of the politicians, either they had seen this at close hands themselves, or it was the stories in the papers. Because we, as one, after the debate in Parliament on the 29th of March, when we had this fantastic breakthrough, someone commented on the forum side, a patient, saying that she was amazed and wondering why is it that our politicians in Parliament seem to know more about ME than my GP.
So you had the problem that GPs didn't really believe the story.
Well, I mean, it's the same problem everywhere.
Yes, right. So what happened then to get the kind of national decision that things should change about ME?
Well, I think the Minister of Health, I mean, she told me that she told the media too, that she was personally engaged in this without saying anything more about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she wanted to do something, but when this other politician, Laila Dovey, which is in opposition, the Christian People's Party, when her office contacted us asking if we could come and have a meeting because she wanted some background material, she wanted to do something about it. And she wanted to forward this interpellation, which I believe is something you don't have here in Britain. And that was the push to get something going. And then what actually happened was that there were many politicians concerned about the case of ME. So we had this debate in Parliament lasting 1 hour and 10 minutes. And first of all, the actual interpellation, which the health minister had to answer to. And she came forward with all these suggestions, and everybody supported it. Everybody agreed. It was absolutely amazing.
Yes. So the interpellation was simply just a presentation of the facts, as it were, to Parliament.
Well, it's the definition was interpellation in Parliament is that. What was the definition?
Is it a petition, or is it?
No, it's more than that. It's a minister or the prime minister or minister has to answer to some policy or act.
Oh, right.
And that will usually lead to a debate. And that's what it did.
And because they'd been well informed through the media, rather than through the medical establishment, they all were able to see the value of what you've been saying.
Well, the nice thing about this was that they actually focused on the patients and how they were cared for, not cared for.
Yes, right.
And that was not acceptable.
Right.
So that was the urgent thing, to do something about the patients, which we all totally agree with that, because this is an urgent matter, that at least while they find out the cause of this or solve their disagreement, at least the patient should get proper care and be looked after and be treated with respect.
Yes.
And then, of course, the other thing is that we need money for proper biomedical research. Now, we have had all this psychosomatic research. They've had their go, they've had their money, and they haven't come up with anything.
Right.
So at least now we have to move forward, and I believe this is a way of moving forward.
Right. And I know also, sorry about the interruption, but I know also that you spent a lot of time burning the midnight oil and working very hard to put together big reports for ministers and for politicians, which you haven't talked about, but it's a very costly thing because you yourself are not well with it, and have this illness as part of one of your problems. It just seemed to me just extraordinary that 1.5 people, or 3.5 it was, wasn't it, when you presented your story, have been able to do so much work with so much energy and so much enthusiasm, despite having to fight an illness as difficult and as disabling as ME.
Yeah.
I think it's been an extraordinary story, and thank you again for doing it all. For international, it's going to have an impact, and also it's given us hope in the UK. So we must make Ian Gibson into the MP or the health minister at least, so we can get some action. But that would be, we're working with the MPs, but we do need to pick up on what you've done and the experience you have had. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you also to you, Byron, and for your contribution to the Norwegian story.
Thank you, Malcolm.